Hi, and welcome to another learning session today. Our focus is on version control using Git and GitHub. If this is your first time checking out our videos, you can subscribe and help us grow our learning community by also sharing it with your friends. Today we are going to look at how Git and GitHub works, but in a more different way. That's from a visual perspective. But before we do that, we need to appreciate the 4 different ways in which Git and GitHub can be segmented into. First is the workspace. This is where your local copy of the files that you are working with are stored. You can manipulate those files using a text editor, whether you are working with Sublime Text or Visual Studio Code. After you've made changes to your file, you add them to the staging environment. The staging environment contains the file changes that you've made. You have the option to revert them back to the working space or add them to the local repository. If you decide to add the changes that are there in the staging environment to the local repository, you can do that using various commands. The local repository has a .git folder which contains all the necessary repository files. The local repository, as the name refers to it, is stored on your local PC or the developer's PC. We also have the upstream or the remote repository. This is where other developers can access what you've done. The difference between a remote repository and a local repository is that the local repository is housed within the developer's computer, while a remote repository is stored on the GitHub servers, meaning it can't be accessed by any developer depending on the rights and the privileges that they have. So let's go back and look at the various commands in each and every of the stages that we just looked at. While in the working space, you might want to check the current status of the files that you're working with. You do that by running the git status command. The git status will show you the files that are being tracked and the files that haven't been tracked. It can also show you the files that have already been staged and the ones that are yet to be staged. If you need to add any file to the staging environment, you do that using the git add command. Git add command informs Git to stage those file changes that you've made. While still in the working space, you might want to get a certain repository from a remote server, let's say GitHub. You run a git clone command, meaning whatever is contained in the remote repository will also be cloned into your local PC. Sometimes when you already have the repository and there are some changes that have been made to that remote repository and you need them to reflect on your local PC, you run a git pull command. If you're collaborating on a certain repository and there are some changes that have been made, they don't automatically appear on your PC. You run git pull command to enable that to happen. When you're in the staging environment, you might want to choose some of the files to be committed. You can also decide to remove some of the files or undo the changes that you've done. But if you want to move the files to the local repository, you run a git commit command. For each git commit command, you need to add a message so that whoever is looking at the commit can see the kind of changes that were made. And suppose you did an error or there are some things that you wanted maybe added to the commit you made. You can do that using the git commit amend file. You'll be given an option to amend whatever you want to amend and now commit them to the local repository. Once your files are moved from the staging environment, they are now contained in the local repository. The local repository has a .git folder which contains all the necessary repository files. There are various commands you can run while you're still in the local repository, but we'll just look at a few. The first one is git log. Git log, it shows you the recent commits and a little bit of more information of who did them and when they did them. You can also run diff between commits to check the differences between the commits that have been made. You might also want to run git branch. Git branch will list all the existing branches that are there. Git branch can also allow flags. Flags are just added options you might want to run. For example, git branch and a flag like D to enable you to delete those branches. Once you're satisfied with your changes, you might want to push them. And pushing involves transferring whatever is in the local repository to the remote repository. Git push can also allow for flags. You might want to push to an existing branch or specify the branch that you need. When you're also in the local repository, there are some changes you might desire them to reflect on your local repository without affecting the working folder. You run git fetch. Git fetch will download all the objects or all the necessary repo files from the remote repository and include it in your in your local repository. You do that by using git fetch, but git fetch doesn't affect the working folder. If you want to directly affect the working folder using the changes you've gotten from the remote repository, you run a git pull command. So it will take those changes and actually put them in the working folder. The remote repository can be accessed by all the other developers who are working on that particular repository, depending on the rights and the privileges they have. You can have your remote repository as public or private. There are also various commands you can run while you're on the remote repository. The first one being git branch R. It will list all the branches that are there in the remote repository. You can check them. You also have git clone. Git clone allows you to have that repository into the working space directly. Like I said, git fetch only allows you to have the changes in the local repository. But if you need those changes appearing in the workspace directly, you run git pull command. It will get all those changes and effect them in the working space. That is just an overview of how these 4 segments relate, right from the working folder to the staging environment to the local repository and finally the upstream repository. In our next tutorial, we are going to see the practical overview of how these commands work by using various examples so that you are able to learn efficiently. So see you in the next video.